Welcome to today's episode. We're your hosts, Eva, Rebecca, Chase, and Irina, and we're excited to take you on a journey through a unique lens for understanding the post Soviet economic transition. So, the ideas of Thorstein Veblen. But before we dive in, have you ever wondered why, in some societies, people suddenly start chasing luxury brands, flashy lifestyles, or exclusive memberships after a major upheaval? That's not just economics, it's identity, it's power, and it's what Veblen helps us decode. As the world continues to undergo rapid economic changes, whether it's the emergence of new global powers, shifting trade dynamics, or the growing influence of consumer culture, it becomes increasingly important to look back at how past transformations have shaped the systems we live in today. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was one such pivotal moment. But to truly understand its aftermath, we need more than just economic data. We need theory, and that's where Veblen comes in. So, why does this topic matter today? So, the transition from centrally planned to market economies wasn't simply a matter of economic reform. It meant redefining entire societies. So, new systems of value, new social classes, and new forms of inequality. This wasn't a smooth or uniform process. It was very chaotic, fast, and often traumatic. Governments were overhauled, industries privatized overnight, and millions of people found themselves navigating a brand new system with little guidance. Some adapted quickly, others were left behind. The region is still grappling with these changes today, from the rise of oligarchs to shifting patterns of consumption and wealth. Veblen's theories, especially his ideas around status, consumer behavior, and social stratification, are often powerful tools for analyzing how these shifts unfolded and why they continue to shape the post-Soviet societies. So, who was Thorstein Veblen, and what was his contribution to economics? So, he was an American economist and sociologist best known for challenging the dominant economic thinking of his time. In his most famous work, The Theory of the Leisure Class, in 1899, he introduced the concept of conspicuous consumption, which is the idea that people often consume goods not for their practical utility, but to signal wealth, power, and social status to others. So for Veblen, consumption wasn't just about satisfying needs, it was a social act, a way to perform one's position in a hierarchy. Veblen argued that economic decisions are rarely rational in the way classical economics assumes. Instead, they are deeply embedded in social expectations, institutional structures, and status dynamics. He believed that people's choices are often driven by a desire to gain or maintain prestige within their community rather than by efficiency or logic. His work helps us see how consumption can become a form of performance and how economic transitions are not just about markets or prices, but about identity, visibility, and power. Veblen's ideas laid the groundwork for what later became institutional economics and continue to influence how we think about inequality, consumer culture, and the social consequences of economic change. So, how did Veblen's theories explain post Soviet consumer behavior? So Veblen's idea of conspicuous consumption is especially useful in understanding what happened in the former Soviet states after 1991. For decades, people had lived under a system that discouraged individual wealth and consumer choice. Suddenly, with the shift to market economies, there was a flood of Western goods, luxury items, and new opportunities to buy and display wealth. This wasn't just about meeting basic needs. It was about showing that people had made it. So people who became wealthy during privatization, especially new oligarchs, used flashy cars, designer clothes, and lavish homes to signal their status. These choices reflected Veblen's insight that consumption is more about social signaling than practicality. In other words, people weren't just buying things, they were buying recognition, power, and a place in a newly emerging elite class. So, what were the long-term consequences of this economic transition? So, through the Veblen lens, we can see that the post-Soviet transition didn't just redistribute wealth. It reshaped who held power and how that power was displayed. Veblen believed that economic systems reproduce social hierarchies, and that's exactly what happened. The rapid privatization of state industries led to massive wealth concentration. A small elite gained control over key assets, and their social dominance was reinforced through status-driven consumption. This created new inequalities, ones not just rooted in income, but in culture, access, and prestige. Over time, conspicuous consumption became a norm, embedding itself in everyday life and helping maintain the gap between elites and everyone else. So Veblen helps us see that post-Soviet economies didn't just shift from communism to capitalism, they also created new social orders where status and identity are performed through what people own, wear, and display.
Now that we've laid the groundwork as to who Thorstein Veblen was and why his ideas still matter, let's dig into how his theories can help us understand what unfolded after the Soviet Union's collapse. This isn't just about economic statistics, it's about the human side of it all. How people redefined what success looked like, how societies adjusted their values, and how buying habits started to reflect identity in a whole new way. When an entire system disappears and a new one takes over almost overnight, Veblen's ideas give us a way to make sense of it all. His takes on ideas such as conspicuous consumption, status emulation, and the social meaning of wealth help explain a lot of the cultural and behavioral shifts that happened in the chaotic post-Soviet era. At the heart of Veblen's thinking is the idea that consumption is not just about meeting needs, it's about sending messages. In his 1899 book titled The Theory of the Leisure Class, Veblen coined the term conspicuous consumption to describe how people purchase goods and services not just for their practical use, but to showcase their status to others. A Rolex doesn't tell time better than a cheap watch, but it tells the world that you can afford it. And that's the point that Veblen's making. According to Veblen, wealth, and especially new wealth, demands visibility. And that visibility isn't random. It's a performance of social hierarchy. The more public, luxurious, or extravagant the display, the more effective it is as a status symbol. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, this kind of behavior surged, particularly among those who profited from privatization. A new class of ultra-wealthy elites was a textbook case of Veblenian conspicuous consumption. These individuals used their newfound wealth not just for comfort or investment, but to visibly claim their place at the top of the new social order. Think luxury cars, designer brands, decorative mansions, and private jets. These weren't just luxuries, they were declarations of dominance in a rapidly transforming society. But conspicuous consumption isn't limited to the elite. Veblen argued that the behavior of the upper classes sets the tone for the rest of society. People lower in the social hierarchy begin to imitate the spending habits of those above them, trying to project an image of upward mobility, even if they can't truly afford it. In the post-Soviet world, we see this clearly. As oligarchs flaunted their wealth, middle and working class citizens began to adopt similar patterns. They bought Western goods, designer knockoffs, and imported cars. Anything that might help them appear as part of the new economic reality. For many, these purchases weren't frivolous, they were symbolic. When pensions disappeared and jobs became unstable, material goods became one of the only reliable ways to assert a sense of identity and success in a rapidly changing landscape. This is exactly the kind of irrational yet socially driven economic behavior that Veblen anticipated. This transition marked a fundamental cultural shift. Under Soviet ideology, wealth accumulation was frowned upon, and personal consumption was limited. The emphasis was on the collective identity, not the individual. But post-collapse, the societal script flipped entirely. Wealth became aspirational as opposed to shameful. The ability to consume both visibly and lavishly became a defining trait of the new capitalist ideal. Veblen helps us understand that this wasn't just a change in economic policy. It was a psychological and sociological transformation. Consumption became a form of communication, a way to navigate new hierarchies and express value in a system where former social markers, such as party membership, military service, and factory seniority, had lost their meaning. So, what does this tell us? Veblen's theories, while developed in the late 19th century, remain remarkably relevant for analyzing the post-Soviet experience. His ideas explain not just how wealth was redistributed, but how it was performed. They help us see the shift from communism to capitalism and how it wasn't just structural, but deeply cultural. In the vacuum left by the Soviet collapse, consumerism filled the void, offering people a new way to define themselves. Whether they were newly rich oligarchs or struggling citizens trying to keep up, their behavior echoed Veblen's insight that in times of upheaval, we don't just buy things, we buy status, belonging, and identity.
Now that we have looked at Thorstein Veblen's theories, let's zoom in on the actual post-Soviet economic transformation itself. What really happened when the USSR collapsed? Who gained, who lost, and how did those changes ripple through society? This wasn't just a change in governance, it was a complete reordering of economic life. In December 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, ending nearly 70 years of centralized economic planning. Almost overnight, a vast multinational economy grounded in state ownership and guaranteed employment crumbled. What followed was not a smooth transition, but chaos. Basic institutions broke down, inflation was soaring, citizens lost their life savings. Entire industrial sectors, once protected by the state, collapsed. Between 1992 and 1998, Russia's GDP fell by 50%, a clear sign of a huge recession. This collapse created a vacuum, which was filled by Western-style capitalism. Under the Soviet system, production, pricing, and employment were centrally planned, while under capitalism, those were now controlled by the market. For the people, this consumer-driven economy was new and confusing, with its larger amount of goods instead of the former scarcity. But the infrastructure, or the protections to make access fair, were still missing. In the early 1990s, economists from the West, especially the US and IMF, encouraged what became known as shock therapy, rapid liberalization, privatization, and deregulation. The idea was to force a quick transition to capitalism, avoiding the stagnation of gradual reform. But instead of producing growth, shock therapy was instead creating problems. For example, the prices were deregulated, causing hyperinflation. In 1992 alone, Russian prices rose more than 2,500%. This led to extreme poverty. While some countries like Poland managed the shock relatively well, Russia and much of the former Soviet bloc struggled. Meanwhile, a new elite emerged, the oligarchs. Through a controversial voucher privatization program, key state industries, especially oil, gas, and minerals, were sold off for way less than their actual worth. Those with insider connections, access to foreign capital, or just pure luck, bought up enormous assets and became billionaires almost immediately. The majority of the population, though, faced economic hardships. By the late 1990s, almost 25% of Russians were living below the poverty line. It was a complete upheaval of the class structure. This kind of inequality didn't just divide people economically. It also reshaped how success was defined and who had power. The oligarchs became highly politically influential, owned the media, and were seen as the winners of the system. Economic geographers like Adrian Smith and Adam Swain have also shown that these inequalities weren't just personal. They were deeply spatial and institutional. The research reveals that post-Soviet transformation wasn't a uniform process. Different regions experienced very different outcomes based on their position in global networks, access to capital, and local governance structures. For instance, urban centers like Moscow attracted foreign investment and became hubs of elite consumption, while peripheral or rural areas were often left behind. This uneven development amplified existing regional inequalities and created a patchwork of prosperity and poverty, something Veblen might see as the material geography of status competition. At the same time, The economy remained unstable. Currencies fluctuated widely. Foreign debt mounted. The 1998 Russian financial crisis led to a full-blown default. Economic survival became an everyday struggle for millions. So how did people respond to this new system? Well, the reactions were mixed and deeply generational, regional, and class-based. For some, especially younger urban populations and those who had access to capital, the new consumer culture was exciting. Western brands, private enterprise, and the freedom to choose were seen as liberating. These individuals became the aspirational group of the new economy, mirroring the leisure class that Veblen described. Displaying wealth became a way of proving success and legitimacy. But for many others, especially older generations, people living in rural areas, and former state workers, this new system felt strange, unstable, and unforgiving. Some longed for the security of the Soviet system, where housing, healthcare, and employment were guaranteed. Nostalgia for socialism grew, particularly in areas that suffered the most from privatization and unemployment. The disillusionment of the people led to cynical mindsets, a distrust in institutions, and even political radicalization. As Veblen noted, when social structures collapse, people don't just suffer economically, but also experience a kind of cultural and psychological shift. And as formal systems failed, informal economies like black markets flourished. Corruption became a part of day-to-day life. According to Transparency International, many post-Soviet states rank among the most corrupt globally, even today. This erosion of institutional trust is crucial. Veblen believed that economic systems are upheld by institutions, and when those institutions are seen as illegitimate and not trustworthy, people will try to break free and find ways to work around them. That's exactly what happened in many post-Soviet countries. So, when we look at the post-Soviet transformation, we're not just looking at economic data. We're witnessing a massive social experiment. The collapse of the USSR changed identities, reshaped power structures, and redefined the role of wealth as a status symbol. And as Veblen would predict, what you owned became who you were.
Now, I'm going to give some examples of specific post-Soviet countries that underwent economic transformation and their experiences. In the modern world, we can observe that countries that were not part of the Soviet Union but were under its influence, such as those in Central and Eastern Europe, generally underwent market economic transformations more smoothly. This is largely due to stronger pre-existing ties to Western Europe, earlier economic reforms, and faster institutional integration into the European Union and global markets. Countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary managed to transition more effectively compared to former Soviet republics like Ukraine, Russia, or Kazakhstan, where weak institutions, oligarchic dominance, and corruption slowed economic progress. After the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union in Russia, the wealth gap widened dramatically. While many people lost their jobs and savings, others used the opportunity to gain immense wealth by rapid privatization. When the Soviet government fell, the former Soviet Communist Party officials, former factory directors, took advantage of privatization, acquiring ownership of their enterprises, while others dismantled factories and sold them for scrap due to the lack of supply chains. The mafia, which had struggled to survive during the height of communism, filled in the power void. Government payroll services almost completely disappeared, so ex-KGB officers, police officers, and Soviet army soldiers joined the mafia's ranks in search of steady employment. Mafia oligarchs seized state-owned assets and enterprises throughout Russia, such as telecommunications and energy networks, or other industries. When these new elites emerged, conspicuous consumption became a defining feature of Russian society in the 1990s and 2000s. Luxury cars, designer brands, and extravagant real estate became status symbols among oligarchs and the new upper class. Russia remains dominated by state capitalism, meaning that the economic system where political loyalty is often more important than economic innovation. The oligarchic system persists, and conspicuous consumption continues as a cultural norm. In Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, oil and gas reserves led economic activities. Kazakhstan is still a resource-dependent country. Like Russia, the political elite and business class in Astana and Almaty embraced Western luxury goods, lavish weddings, and high-end real estate. Ukraine also had quite a chaotic transition. Like Russia, it experienced oligarchic capture of power. However, it has aspirations for reform. Similarly to Russia, Ukraine's oligarchs illustrated conspicuous consumption, gaining more and more luxury assets, while many citizens struggled with inflation and job insecurity. Specifically, in the 2000s, Ukraine's capital Kiev saw an explosion of Western luxury brands and elite real estate developments. Baltic states, such as Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, went in a different direction. Originally, they pursued more institutional reforms and successfully integrated in the European Union economy. Even though some inequality was still present, more middle class emerged, leading to a smoother transition towards market economy. To finish up this section, I would also like to share personal experience from my parents, who lived through the dissolution of the Soviet Union and its implications in Ukraine. They reflected that polarization of society and hard economic conditions did not emerge overnight. Prior to the official collapse, people were experiencing deficits of many goods in the stores. After the collapse, social values shifted. Educated people lost their jobs or wages were not paid to them. Therefore, they were forced to go do manual jobs. For some time, there was also no money, which was replaced with coupons. People were living off what they grew in the village or went to neighboring countries such as Belarus or Poland to trade something. Wealthy class also emerged gradually by accumulating capital through trade, privatizing factories, and buying assets cheaply to later sell them at much higher price, setting up an unequal system.
To close, Veblen's theories give us a powerful framework for understanding the post-Soviet transition, not just as an economic shift, but as a deeper cultural and social transformation. His ideas on conspicuous consumption and status seeking help explain how, in the absence of strong institutions, wealth became the dominant signal of power and legitimacy. Economic choices weren't simply about survival or efficiency, they became tools for social distinction and identity in a rapidly changing world.
As old structures crumbled and new market dynamics took hold, consumerism quickly rose to the forefront. Luxury goods, Western brands, and lavish lifestyles became markers of success in the new capitalist order. This wasn't just about individual choice. It reflected a broader societal shift where owning and displaying wealth became a form of social currency. Over time, this mindset took root across social classes, reinforcing inequality and reshaping how people viewed success and self-worth. It is important to note that while younger people embraced more capitalistic values, older generations may still hold the socialist views in high regard.
These conditions also allowed a strong oligarchic system to emerge, one where a small elite consolidated wealth, influence, and political control. This system has proven incredibly durable, supported by both cultural norms and weak institutional checks. Real change remains unlikely, without significant internal reform or external pressure. Especially the current situation in Russia has shown again that having opposing views than the government and elites is actively repressed. For example, those having different opinions regarding the war have to fear getting arrested. So what is the key takeaway? Economic transformation without institutional accountability often deepens inequality and corruption. But through Veblen's lens, we can better understand the forces that shape these outcomes, and perhaps envision more equitable futures where power and prosperity aren't reserved for the few.